The cold had teeth that winter. It wasn't the clean, crisp cold of an autumn morning, but a deep, predatory chill that seeped into the marrow of your bones and stayed there a constant, unwelcome guest. For 3 years, I'd been the Marshal of Absolution, a town that rarely lived up to its name, and I had come to know the nuances of its winters intimately. This one, however, felt different. It was hungrier, more relentless, as if the vast white emptiness of the plains had finally decided to swallow what little warmth in life remained. My name is Wyatt Kane. At 34, I felt older than the worn granite peaks that watched over the valley. The war had done that, scouring away my youth and leaving behind a man who preferred the company of silence. It wasn't just the battles, the noise, and the blood. It was the quiet moments after the faces of the men you couldn't save replaying in the firelight. I'd seen a boy from Georgia no older than 17 bleed out while talking about the peach trees in his father's orchard. That memory, more than any cannon blast, was the ghost that rode with me in the biting wind. A bloodstained handkerchief from that day was still tucked in my saddlebag, a penance I could never quite fold away. I came west seeking a place quiet enough to drown out the echoes, but all I found was a different kind of war. One fought against the land, against lawlessness, and most profoundly against myself. My cabin was a 2-hour ride from town, a small, sturdy defense against the world, and I had long since convinced myself that its solitude was a choice, not a sentence. I was on my northern patrol, a thankless task performed with grim regularity. The wind howled, a lonesome tune through the pines, a high, mournful sound that scraped at the nerves. My horse Vulcan, a big roan with more sense than most men I knew, snorted clouds of steam that froze almost instantly in the air. My gray coat lined with thick sheepskin was my only shield against the elements, but even it felt insufficient. The cold found its way through the seams, like 100 tiny daggers against my skin. It was in this state of frozen monotony, my mind replaying the sight of Georgia peaches turning red in the dust, that I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape against the stark white of a snowdrift, huddled at the base of a skeletal aspen, an anomaly in a world of white. My war-honed instinct screamed ambush. I reined Vulcan to a halt so sharply he tossed his head in protest. My hand dropped by reflex to the cold, reassuring weight of the Colt at my hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth by years of habit. My eyes scanned the silent, snow-laden trees, searching for the glint of a rifle barrel or the puff of a hidden breath. There was nothing. The world was utterly still, muffled by a fresh blanket of snow. A silence so deep it felt loud. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in these parts, won out over caution. I dismounted my boots, sinking deep into the powder with a soft crunch. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. I approached the shape with the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking into a trap, my senses on fire, every nerve ending screaming. The closer I got, the more the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a bundle of discarded rags or a dead animal. It was a person. A woman. She was curled into a tight ball, a desperate final attempt to conserve a life that was clearly fading. Her dress, made of finely worked deerskin, was torn and shredded, offering little protection from the elements that were actively trying to claim her. One shoulder was bare, the skin an alarming shade of blue-white, the color of a frozen lake under a winter moon. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was fanned out against the snow, each strand laced with delicate, cruel crystals of ice. Apache, that much was clear from the high cheekbones and the intricate beadwork that remained on a fragment of her dress. My stomach clenched into a tight, angry knot. This wasn't just the work of the cold. The violent tears in her clothing, the raw, bruised skin, visible beneath, spoke of a brutal struggle, of a violation that went beyond mere survival. Someone had done this to her. They had broken her and left her for the winter to finish the job. A wave of cold fury, sharper and more bitter than the wind, washed over me. It was an old, familiar feeling, the righteous anger I thought the war had burned out of me. Crouching beside her, I pulled off a glove with my teeth, the leather stiff and cold. I pressed 2 numb fingers against her neck, under the line of her jaw. For a heart-stopping moment that stretched into an eternity, there was nothing. My own heart hammered against my ribs. Damn it, you're too late. Then I felt it. A pulse so faint, so thready, it was more a memory of a heartbeat than the real thing. A desperate flutter against the void. She was alive. Just barely. The question of what to do next weighed on me as heavily as the snow-filled sky. Bringing an Apache woman to Absolution was like carrying a lit torch into a powder keg. The raids last autumn were still fresh wounds, and the townsfolk in their fear and anger rarely bothered to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Leaving her here, however, was a death sentence. It was walking past the boy from Georgia all over again. My father's voice echoed in my memory, a low murmur beneath the wind's shriek. Right is right, Wyatt. Especially when it's hard. The decision was made. There was no other choice a man could live with. With a grunt that was lost in the wind, I slid my arms beneath her. She was shockingly light, a fragile collection of bones and chilling skin. Her body was stiff, unyielding as frozen timber. As I lifted her, a faint, almost inaudible sound escaped her blue-tinged lips, a ghost of a word. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, dark and unfocused, vast pools of night before sliding shut again. She went limp in my arms, a dead weight that felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. The ride back to my cabin was an eternity of slow, careful movement. I wrapped her in my greatcoat, the sheepskin still holding some of my warmth, and pressed her against my chest. I could feel her shallow, hitching breaths against my ribs. Each one a small miracle, each pause between them, a terrifying void where I held my own breath. When the faint plume of smoke from my chimney finally came into view, a thin, gray line against the darkening sky, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled me washed through my body. I kicked the door open with my boot and carried her straight inside. The cabin, which had always been my sanctuary of solitude, suddenly felt small, crowded with the awesome responsibility of another life. I laid her down on my bed, the only bed, and gently drew the patchwork quilts over her still form. In the warm, flickering light of the kerosene lamp, the extent of her injuries was horrifyingly clear. Dark, ugly bruises marred her ribs and thigh like storm clouds on her skin, and on her shoulder an older, more sinister mark scarred her flesh. A burn shaped too deliberately to be an accident. It was a brand, a symbol of ownership, of utter degradation. My hands, usually rock-steady, trembled with a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. I stoked the fire until it roared, a physical manifestation of my own fury. As I worked, a feeling I couldn't name settled in my chest. It was more than pity, deeper than the anger I felt toward her unknown assailants. It was a stark, unyielding sense of responsibility. I had intervened. I had pulled her back from the edge. Her life, for better or worse, was now tied to mine. When I brought a cup of warm broth to her lips, her eyes flickered open again, and this time there was a spark of awareness in them. They were dark, deep-set eyes, and in their depths, I saw a fear that cut me to the quick. It wasn't the fear of death. She looked as if she had already made her peace with that. It was the fear of me, of what the man who had saved her might demand in return. The fear of a debt she couldn't possibly pay. "You're safe now," I said, the sound rough in the quiet room. "My name is Wyatt Kane. I'm the Marshal. I won't let any harm come to you here." She didn't respond, her eyelids sinking shut once more, but I thought I saw some of the tension leave the tight line of her body. For the rest of that long, dark night, I sat in the chair beside the bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest under the quilts. I didn't know who she was or what horrors she had fled. I only knew that on a frozen patrol at the edge of the world, I had made a choice, and I had the unshakable feeling that the quiet, solitary life of Marshal Wyatt Kane was over. The long night bled into a gray, muted dawn. I hadn't slept, not really. I dozed fitfully in my worn armchair, my Colt resting on the small table beside me, my senses tuned to every sound in the cabin. The old soldier in me never truly stood down. Rest was a luxury, vigilance a necessity. Each time she whimpered in her fevered sleep, my head would snap up, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. With the first pale light filtering through the shutters, I leaned over her. The bluish tint had completely receded from her skin, replaced by a pale, almost translucent quality. I placed the back of my hand against her forehead. The feverish heat from the night had broken. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped my lips in a ragged sigh that fogged in the cold air of the cabin. I moved quietly, feeding fresh logs into the stove, until a satisfying roar filled the silence. The cabin, my small fortress of solitude, felt different now, charged with a new, fragile purpose. When I stepped back inside from breaking the ice in the water barrel, her eyes were open. This time they were clear, focused, and fixed directly on me. She lay perfectly still, a wild-cornered thing, her dark hair a stark contrast against my white pillowcase. Fear was still there, etched into the tense line of her jaw, but beneath it was a sharp, assessing intelligence. She was taking my measure, weighing my every move, my every breath. I felt the weight of her gaze like a physical touch, a silent probe searching for the predator I might be. I set the heavy water bucket down slowly, the sloshing sound echoing in the stillness. I made my movements deliberate, non-threatening. "You're awake," I said. The words sounded loud and clumsy. She watched me, her silence a heavy blanket in the small room. I could see the questions in her eyes, the weariness of an animal that has known too many traps. I poured a cup of water from the bucket and held it out to her. For a long moment she just stared at it, then at me, her gaze flickering between the two. Finally, with a wince of pain that she quickly suppressed, she pushed herself up on one elbow. She took the cup with a hand that trembled almost uncontrollably. She drank in small, cautious sips, her eyes never leaving my face. When the cup was empty, her lips parted. Her voice was a dry, hoarse whisper, like autumn leaves skittering across stone. "Dolores." Just one word. Her name. It grounded her, gave her an identity beyond the broken victim I had found in the snow. It was a claim to herself, a defiant spark in the ashes. I gave a slow nod, repeating the name to commit it to memory, letting it settle in the room between us. Dolores. The days that followed fell into a strange new rhythm, a silent dance of two solitary people learning the shape of each other's space. My cabin, once a bastion of monastic silence, was now filled with the subtle sounds of her existence. The soft pad of stocking feet on the wooden floor, the whisper of a needle through hide, the quiet sigh of breath in the chair by the brong fire. I felt her presence like a low hum beneath the surface of my own solitary life, a constant low-grade disruption to the peace I had so carefully cultivated. One afternoon, as I sat cleaning my rifle, the familiar sharp scent of gun oil filling the air, she finally broke the companionable silence. Why, her voice was still rough, rusty from disuse, but stronger now. I paused, a cleaning rag halfway through the barrel of my Winchester, the motion frozen. Why, what, her gaze was direct, unwavering, cutting through all pretense. "You carried me here. You could have ridden on, left me." It was the question I knew had been sitting between us since she awoke. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes tracing the grain of the wooden table. The truth was complicated, rooted deeper in the man I was before the badge. "Seemed wrong to leave you," I said, finally, my voice low. "A man is defined by the things he chooses to walk past, and the things he chooses to carry. I couldn't walk past you." She held my gaze for a long time, her dark eyes searching my face, digging for the truth beneath the words. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod and turned her attention back to her sewing. But I saw a change in her hands. They moved with a new steadiness, as if my answer had unburdened her of some invisible weight, the weight of a debt she thought she owed. That night, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, I prepared to settle into my armchair. But when I glanced at the bed, I saw that Dolores had moved to the far side, leaving a clear, empty space beside her. Her eyes were open, watching me in the dim light. I hesitated, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The invitation was unspoken, but unmistakable. It wasn't an offer of intimacy, I knew that. It was an acknowledgement, a concession that my presence was not a threat. It was the first fragile seed of trust. To lie down beside her would be to cross a threshold. To remain in the chair would be to preserve the distance. My body ached from the cold, hard floor, but some instinct, some deep-seated need to prove I was not like the men who had hurt her, held me back. I walked to the bed, my boots silent on the floorboards. Instead of lying down, I took the spare blanket from the foot of it and tucked it more securely around her shoulders. Her skin was warm to the touch, and for a brief second her fingers brushed mine. The contact was electric, a spark in the cold room that shot straight up my arm. "Rest well, Dolores," I murmured, my voice thick. I returned to my chair, settled in, and let my eyes drift shut. I heard her shift, a soft rustle of quilts, and in the steady, even rhythm of her breathing that followed, I found a sense of peace that had eluded me for a very long time. I didn't see the way she reached out in the near darkness, her hand hovering over the empty space beside her, testing the air between us before letting it rest on the warm spot my presence would have made. The next day she sat by the stove, my sewing kit in her lap, clumsily trying to stitch the torn strap of her deerskin dress. As I watched her fierce, quiet determination, I knew we couldn't stay hidden forever. The world would come looking. "We have to go into town," I said, my voice quiet. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her body went rigid, her eyes wide, with a palpable dread that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. "Town. I'm out of supplies. More importantly, we need medicine," I explained, my expression grim. "It's better they see you with me under my protection. Better we face it head-on on our own terms." I met her gaze without flinching, pouring every ounce of sincerity I possessed into my own. "I will not let anyone harm you, Dolores. I give you my word, no one will lay a hand on you while I am standing." The ride to Absolution was slow, Vulcan laboring through the deep snow. Dolores settled behind me, her hands resting lightly on my hips, not for intimacy, but for balance. Her touch was tentative, a mere ghost of pressure, yet it sent a jolt through me, a current of warmth against the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Every shift of her body against my back was a stark reminder of her presence, of the forbidden territory we were navigating. The scent of her hair, wood smoke, and something wild like crushed sage filled my senses. As we turned onto the main street, the town seemed to hold its breath. A rancher froze with his hand on the livery door. Two women fell silent, their eyes following us with open hostility. From the swinging doors of the saloon, a pair of leering faces appeared, their expressions a mixture of crude curiosity and menace. I kept my face a mask of cold authority, my hand resting casually on the butt of my Colt, a silent warning. I dismounted in front of Croft's Mercantile and turned to help Dolores down. She slid into my arms, her body trembling slightly, but when her feet touched the ground, she stood tall. She kept her head bowed, her dark hair, a curtain hiding her face, but I felt her spine straighten. Pride, even in the face of fear. The bell above the door announced us with a jangling shriek. Silas Croft looked up, and his face froze, his thin lips tightening into a bloodless line. His gaze flickered from me to Dolores, then back again, his disapproval a palpable force. "Marshal," he said, his voice dripping with a false cordiality that set my teeth on edge. "Didn't realize you'd taken on company. Just fill the order." "Silas," I said, my voice low, but carrying the unmistakable edge of command. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, lingered on Dolores with a look that made my hand itch for my gun. "You sure this is wise, Wyatt, bringing her here? Folks are unsettled." I met his gaze and let him see the cold fire in my own, a look I had perfected in the war, one that promised swift and final consequences. "Put it on the scale, Silas." The unspoken threat hung in the air like smoke. He turned and began measuring out the flour without another word. But as we were about to leave, the saloon doors swung open again. A woman stepped out, her scarlet dress a slash of color against the town's drab browns. Her dark hair was piled high, and her eyes sharp, and knowing landed on me with a familiar cynical amusement. Maria. She owned the saloon, and we shared a history that had burned hot and ended badly. "Well, I'll be damned," she purred, her voice carrying across the street. "Look what the blizzard dragged in." And with a stray, her eyes raked over Dolores, a flicker of something possessive and angry in their depths. Before I could respond, a new figure appeared in the saloon doorway. Casting a long silhouette, the piano music faltered and died. A hush fell. The man who entered was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black. His face was handsome in a cruel way, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes as black and cold as obsidian chips. A silver inlaid Colt sat low on his hip. He moved with the lethal grace of a panther, his gaze sweeping the street with an air of absolute ownership. Behind him, two armed men fanned out. Maria's breath hitched. She took a half-step back, her playful demeanor vanishing. "Esteban," she whispered the name, a poisoned dart. My blood ran cold. Dolores went rigid behind me, her fingers digging into my arm with enough force to bruise. I felt a tremor run through her entire body, a vibration of pure terror. Esteban's eyes scanned every face, dismissing them, searching. He was a hunter, and he had scented his prey. "I'm looking for my property," Esteban announced to the silent street, his voice smooth and cultured, which made it all the more menacing. A slender thing, Apache. She was seen traveling with a man, a gringo with a marshal's badge. His cold eyes settled on me, then moved past me to the woman I was shielding. A slow, cruel smile touched his lips. He saw the brand on Dolores' shoulder, a mark I now recognized as his own. "Ah," he said, the sound a silken threat. "There you are, my love. The game is over." He took a step forward, his hand hovering over his silver-inlaid gun. "Marshal, I'll thank you to step aside. This is a private matter between a man and his wife." Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. I saw everything with a chilling clarity, the sweat beading on Silas Croft's forehead, the way Maria's hand instinctively went to the small derringer. I knew she kept tucked in her garter, the hungry look in the eyes of Esteban's men. I didn't move a muscle. I could feel Dolores trembling behind me, her breath coming in short, panic gasps against my back. Her fear was a living thing coiling in my own gut. "She's not your wife," I said, my voice a low growl. "And she's not going anywhere." Esteban's smile widened, a predator's baring of teeth. "Brave words, but bravery is just a prettier name for foolishness. She belongs to me. I have the papers. I have the brand." He gestured to her shoulder, and a wave of revulsion and rage washed over me. "She ran. She must be taught to obey. You understand, Marshal? The law is about order. The law is about protecting people." I countered, shifting my weight slightly, my fingers brushing the handle of my Colt. "Not property." The tension snapped. One of Esteban's men, a burly man with a pockmarked face, took it as a signal. His hand dropped to his gun, but he was slow. Years of instinct and bloodshed had made me faster than thought. Before the man's gun had even cleared leather, my Colt was in my hand, spitting fire. The explosion was deafening. The pockmarked man grunted, a look of surprise on his face as a dark stain blossomed on his chest. He crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. The second gunman drew, but I was already moving, shoving Dolores behind me toward the cover of the mercantile doorway. A bullet splintered the wooden post where my head had been. Maria screamed and dove back into the saloon. Esteban, impossibly calm, drew his own silver-inlaid pistol, not with panic speed, but with deliberate lethal grace. I fired again, aiming for the second gunman. He cried out and staggered back, clutching his arm. Now it was just me and Esteban. "Impressive," Esteban said, his voice calm amidst the ringing in our ears and the smell of gunpowder. "But she is mine. You cannot have what belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," I snarled. From the corner of my eye, I saw Dolores. She wasn't cowering. She had snatched a heavy iron skillet from a display barrel outside the store. Her face was a mask of terror and rage. Esteban saw her too. A triumphant, possessive gleam entered his eyes. "Dolores," he called out, his voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "Come to me, my love. This foolishness is over." She didn't move. She just stared, her eyes locked with mine. In that single, silent glance, everything passed between us, the fear, the desperation, and a defiant, unbreakable promise. I gave her the slightest shake of my head. It was the opening Esteban needed. He fired. The bullet tore through the muscle of my left shoulder, a searing white-hot pain. I grunted, stumbling back. Esteban advanced, a predator closing in for the kill. But he had underestimated Dolores. She screamed a high, piercing shriek of pure rage and charged. Not at him, but at the second gunman, who was trying to raise his pistol again. She brought the heavy skillet down on his head with a sickening crack. He dropped like a stone. The distraction was all I needed. Ignoring the fire in my shoulder, I brought my Colt up and fired. The shot was true. Esteban staggered back, his hand flying to his gut, a look of disbelief on his handsome face. He looked down at the blood spreading through his black coat, then back up at Dolores. "You," he whispered, then crashed to the floor. Silence descended once more, thick and heavy. I pushed myself to my feet, my arms screaming in protest. I walked over to where Esteban lay, kicking the silver pistol away. It was over. I turned and limped toward Dolores. She ran to me, her hands hovering over my wounded shoulder, her eyes wild with fear and relief. "Wyatt," I grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Now." The whole town would be on us in minutes. I stumbled toward Vulcan, leaning on her. We had won. We had survived. But as I pulled myself into the saddle, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The world tilted, the edges of my vision turning dark. I clung to the saddle horn, the blood from my wound dripping onto the dusty ground, forming a single crimson teardrop in the dirt. They were free, but they were wounded, bleeding, and a long, dark road lay ahead. The world came back to me in fragments. The rhythmic sway of the horse, the burning agony in my shoulder, the cool touch of a hand on my feverish forehead. We rode for a day and a night, pushing deeper into the Badlands, a desolate, jagged landscape of rock and shadow. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my only anchor the small, determined woman who held me in the saddle, her arm wrapped tightly around my waist. Her body was a constant warm presence against my back, a shield against the encroaching darkness. We finally found shelter in a hidden alcove, a shallow cave carved into a canyon wall by wind and time. Dolores eased me off the horse, her movements gentle but strong. I collapsed onto the sandy floor, my body slick with sweat. The bullet was still in me, a hot piece of lead poisoning my blood. "It has to come out," she said, her voice quiet but firm. I watched through a haze of pain as she built a small fire, her hands moving with a newfound certainty. She heated the blade of my knife in the flames until it glowed red, then tore a strip from her own dress for bandages. She knelt beside him, the firelight casting a warm glow on her face, making her eyes seem even darker, deeper. "This will hurt," she whispered. Her breath was warm on my cheek. I just gritted my teeth and nodded, biting down on a piece of leather. The pain was a living thing, a white-hot serpent that coiled and struck deep inside me. I refused to cry out as she probed the wound. Her touch was surprisingly steady. She was no longer the frightened creature I had found hiding in the snow. The desert, the fear, the violence, it had burned away. Her fragility, leaving behind something hard and resilient, as beautiful and unforgiving as the land itself. I felt the sickening scrape of metal on bone, then a final agonizing pull. I blacked out. When I awoke, the sun was high in the sky. The fever had broken. I was weak, but my mind was clear. Dolores was asleep beside me, her head resting on her arms, her breathing slow and even. The fire had died down to embers. My shoulder was tightly bandaged. She had saved my life. I lay there for a long time, just watching her. I saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the dark circles under her eyes. I saw the strength in the line of her jaw, the pride that had never left her. I was a man who had spent his life running from connection, who believed that to care for someone was to give fate a target. But looking at her now, I knew I could no longer run. She was no longer a complication. She was my compass. She stirred her eyes, fluttering open. When she saw I was awake, a slow, tired smile touched her lips. "You are alive. Thanks to you, I rasped my throat dry." She poured some water from our canteen onto a cloth and gently wiped my face. Her touch was no longer hesitant. It was intimate and possessive. The space between us, once filled with silence and suspicion, was now charged with a powerful, unspoken truth. They had bled for each other. They had killed for each other. They had chosen each other. "Wyatt," she said, her voice soft. What now? I looked out at the endless expanse of rock and sky. The world was still a dangerous place. There would always be other Estebans, other towns like Absolution. But for the first time in a decade, the emptiness inside me felt less empty. I reached out with my good hand, my fingers finding hers, lacing through them. Her hand was small and warm in his. "Now," I said, my voice gaining strength, "we find a place to stop running." She didn't speak. She just squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I leaned back against the cool rock of the cave wall, her hand held tight in mine. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, a lonely, mournful song. But inside the cave, there was only the quiet, steady rhythm of two hearts beating as one. The war was over. The reckoning was done. And in the heart of the desolate wilderness, against all odds, they had found their home,